research that showed a correlation between these hormonal spikes and growth. But as any good researcher will tell you, correlation does not equal causation. It wasn't because of the hormonal response, it was in spite of it, really, that you were seeing somewhat greater growth. People think that research is going to tell you what to do or to prove certain things. Research really tends to suggest certain things. And there's always going to be, or generally will be, conflicting research. One study will show one thing, another study kind of shows something else. And you start to look at, you synthesize the body of evidence to see what the preponderance of evidence shows. And certainly, I think that anyone who's looked at the research will say the preponderance of evidence does not show that these hormonal spikes really should be used for programming. I think that would be the best way to say it.
Brad, well, welcome. So thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. How are you?
My pleasure, Steve. I'm great.
Fantastic. Now, look, for anyone who's not familiar with your background, I'm sure loads of people follow you on social media, but could you just give me a bit of a background to you?
Sure. I'm a researcher, educator, professor. I teach. I'm the director of the Human Performance and Fitness program, the graduate program at Lehman College in the Bronx. I do a lot of research. I've published over 300 peer-reviewed articles. I do a lot of lecturing in terms of speaking, international speaking. And my primary role is as an educator, that I look to inform the public and the people at large about fitness, the importance of it, and evidence-based practice around fitness.
And as an athlete, I mean, I can see a few shots of you doing a few poses as a bodybuilder in a previous life, or do you still do that?
I haven't stepped on stage in a long time. Certainly, I still work out quite strictly. But yeah, I bodybuilded or is that a word? Bodybuilded. I was a bodybuilding competitor for multiple years, for 4 or 5 years in my 30s. So.
Okay, 30s. Is that quite late? I don't know.
Yeah, not necessarily. Some people do it early. Some people don't get into it. Bodybuilding is a sport, fortunately, that can be practiced across the wide spectrum of age ranges. So.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And an athletic background before that, or did you come to it later?
Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, I played baseball. I played some sports, but uh, in my once got into my adult years, really, I did more mixed martial arts. I did studied various martial art forms and bodybuilding.
Mm. Was there anything specifically that drew you to researching muscle growth, strength, power?
Well, yeah. So I was a skinny kid throughout my high school years, and throughout all my adolescent years. And bodybuilding literally changed my life. It changed the way I felt about myself, thought about myself, my whole attitude. And it, I guess, once a bro, always a bro kind of thing. That I wanted to. First of all, I started looking into science to help me achieve my potential after I hit plateaus on basic routines that I was doing. And it just progressed. And as I became I was a personal trainer for many years before becoming an educator. And as a trainer, I worked with a lot of bodybuilders and figure fitness competitors, female. And I always was looking for the better way to get clients results. And it kind of just was an outgrowth of all that.
Mm. So I wanted to get in touch with you as a follow along with your work and what you communicate on various different platforms. And what was fascinating for me was some of the new evidence that's emerging in the strength and muscle growth literature. And I found that particularly interesting, that it was challenging a few people. It was challenging a few people's ideas, principles of training, and that piqued my interest to get in touch. And I'd love to cover some of that with you today. But before perhaps we get into some of that emerging evidence, could you sort of take me back in time a little bit and paint a picture of anyone who's listening? If we rewound, say, 15, 20 years or so, about the major factors that we'd be considering, or the principles that we might be under using for strength, power, muscle hypertrophy programming, and then maybe we can get into how it's changed with recent times.
So just to clarify, you're asking what were the previous
Yeah, well, if you were to go back in time 15, 20 years or so, what would be the sort of the key principles of programming, those sort of solid blocks of knowledge that nearly everybody was accepting before some of the new emerging evidence challenged it?
Yeah, I'll stick to hypertrophy, muscle growth for this particular topic because I don't think the strength data has changed meaningfully in that regard, or certainly as much. But hypertrophy is it's the area, first of all, that is a primary area of interest as far as I am concerned, and really has undergone, I think, the most radical changes in terms of what we now believe based or in opposition to what we once believed. So yeah, hypertrophy programming a lot of it was based on what's called the hormone hypothesis. So there was a theory that the post-exercise hormonal response, so at what your hormone spike would be after a resistance training bout, was a primary driver of muscle growth, and that basically it's testosterone, growth hormone, and IGF-1, which are anabolic hormones. And they are spiked under certain conditions for longer periods of time, or to a greater extent, but really for only about an hour, 2 hours max post-exercise. And it was thought that that was this critical window that drove the hypertrophic process. And that led to theories about how to program for hypertrophy, including short rest periods, generally moderate repetitions, multiple sets. I mean, some of them have actually shown to have validity, but not because of the reason. So long story short, the hormone hypothesis was challenged, and most of the evidence we have now shows it really does not mean much, if anything, as far as the growth response is concerned. That just because you experience a greater hormonal response does not mean you're going to get more hypertrophy. And conversely, if you don't get a high hormonal response, doesn't mean you're not going to get robust hypertrophy. So that, I think, that kind of gives the background. That was a primary method of training, or primary method of programming. But there were other theories that came out of the gym that people would promote. I mean, another popular one was that you should not train with less than 12 to certainly 15 repetitions, that the weight would basically be too light to target, to recruit, and to stimulate the highest threshold motor units, which are associated with the type 2 muscle fibers, the ones that have the highest growth potential. So generally, it was thought that heavier loads were more conducive towards muscle growth.
Hmm. And so, why do you think we were entrenched with that? Were we programming for testosterone growth hormone responses? Was it we were sort of trying to manipulate or try and create a physiological response as opposed to the actual adaptation that we want to get? Is it a little bit like
No,
setting hard training sessions for intervals to get a high lactate, not necessarily run fast?
yeah, no, it was because there was research that showed a correlation between these hormonal spikes and growth. But as any good researcher will tell you, correlation does not equal causation. So some of these correlations, there were spurious correlations that just it wasn't because of the hormonal response, it was in spite of it, really, that you were seeing somewhat greater growth. And more sophisticated research that tried to look at the actual tie-in that had better methods to try to draw causality did not show that these hormonal spikes were causative of growth, or if they were, it was the evidence would suggest that they had little effect. So again, I don't want to. People think that research is going to tell you what to do or to prove certain things. Research really tends to suggest certain things, and there's always going to be, or generally will be, conflicting research. One study will show one thing, another study kind of shows something else, and you start to look at, you synthesize the body of evidence to see what the preponderance of evidence shows. And certainly I think that anyone who's looked at the research will say the preponderance of evidence does not show that these hormonal spikes really should be used for programming. I think that would be the best way to say it.
And if I could just stick with that idea of where have we come from, the heavy loads, the low reps, is that based on good research too, or is that really as much actually just some ego infecting? This is the way to do it. This is the way to train.
Well, I think there's some of that in terms of the gym lore, kind of the bro logic, if you will. Or some people would call it bro science. But there was certain science around that too, showing that they would have EMG studies that would show that if you lift light loads, you would not get as high electromyographic activity with light loads. But there was problems with that. You have to then look into the research, because the research would not be taken to failure, not be, or even a point close to failure. So yeah, if you lift a light load for, let's say, 8 reps, and then you lift an 8 RM for 8 reps, where your last reps are really struggling, you're not comparing apples to apples. And what the research really over time started to show was that if you were training closer to failure, you were going to start to recruit the higher threshold motor units associated with these fast twitch, the type 2 muscle fibers. And I think more importantly, the research was not based on any longitudinal, or very little longitudinal research, which actually looked at muscle growth. So we started over the past 10 years or so, we've gotten this explosion of research into light load training, where we're looking at 20, 30 plus reps and comparing it directly to kind of that quote unquote hypertrophy zone, that 8 to 12, 6 to 12 rep range. And there's no differences. Our group carried out that research. We've carried out several studies on the topic. And again, the research is really clear on that. There's few topics that I would say I have that I would really draw strong inferences from based on the literature. That's one of them, that you can get whole muscle hypertrophy training across a wide spectrum of loading ranges. And that's anywhere from, your 3 to 5 rep range, so your powerlifting type rep range, all the way up to 30 plus reps.
And we're talking here about muscle hypertrophy, so cross-sectional area of the muscle belly. We're talking about fractional synthesis rate, so uptake of protein into the muscle. We're talking about some of this fundamental underpinning, if the muscles got bigger, science that is like for like similar effects, loading for 30 or so reps all the way down to 30, and that's a huge percentage of 1 rep max there. That I can imagine that's quite challenging for people. It seems like people got quite animated about the findings. How have people responded to you, and why do you think that's the case?
Yeah, there's you always get backlash. So first of all, with a lot of people, fitness has become religion, and if they believe something, they don't want to. If you challenge someone's beliefs, people get it's almost an insult to certain people. Like as a, to me, a true scientist, and I consider myself certainly a true scientist, it's a badge of courage to change your opinion if you're doing it for the right, based on science, not just because you're looking to make a buck or something. But if you're, to me, I'm constantly reassessing my beliefs. And if the literature starts to show something else, I'll then reassess. I'll say, well, why is it conflicting with what science used to show and what my beliefs were? And when the evidence becomes strong enough, I start to change my opinion, or certainly question my opinion. But there are people that somehow feel that this is a threat to their ego. And there's also a lot of people, they just don't understand science. And they kind of think, well, I've been doing it and I get quote unquote results. So don't tell me, what I could be doing elsewhere, otherwise, because this is what I've been doing well with. And that's all well and good. I don't tell, for me as a scientist, I give people options. I tell them what this shows, and I give them my opinion as to how you might be able to put this into practice. Not only am I a scientist, but I've consulted with some of the top pro bodybuilders in the world and high level amateurs. So I've had a long career. And as I said, I was a personal trainer before becoming a researcher educator. And I've been working in the field and consulting with that crowd. So I also speak from an applied standpoint. I'm not just
Yeah.
spewing theory. I also have a very intricate understanding of how the concepts can be put into practice. And again, that doesn't mean there's many different ways to go about programming. So I would also never say that my way of programming is necessarily the way to program. It's something I know that can be successful, and it's based on evidence. But once we understand the research, we can have differences of opinion, how to go about it. And certainly what I'd also say is that I never give the same program to everyone, because people respond differently. And the true evidence-based practitioner is always going to use the science and use their own expertise to then work in context with the individual and tailor the program based upon certain templates and certain principles to that individual. And there will be manipulations of frequency and load and volume and other variables that will all come into play based on that individual response.
Mm. Yeah, and as applied scientist myself, that to me is, it just opens up options. So it's a case of I want to get results for somebody, so it opens up options to be able to use different training modes, different methodologies. And what's interesting, I suppose, it's similar to the high intensity literature, I think, in endurance sports, is that it's saying it's equivalent, or it's getting similar effects, or there's no difference in effects. It's not necessarily saying overall, as far as I understand, that it's a superiority to
Correct.
and so in that sense, if it has worked for somebody using 3 to 5 reps sets, then that's fine. Go for it. That's great for you, but don't rule out this other way that might be useful for you at some point in the future, because that could come in.
It's so well articulated, Steve. And I'd go further. First of all, it doesn't necessarily have to be a binary choice where you're doing heavy loads or light loads. There
Right.
may be benefits to combining the approaches. I don't know how much you want to get into that, but certainly from a logical standpoint, there'd be reasons why doing, or there are potential reasons why doing a combination of heavier and lighter loads might have a synergistic effect, certainly on muscle growth. But also, it also could be dependent on the population. Are you working around an injury? Well,
Yeah.
heavier loads can overstress joints. Do you have osteoarthritis or other conditions, particularly like for the elderly? So it gives them other options. I do want to make the point, though, is that the research and the concept is based on taking the sets close to failure. If not going to failure, certainly being in the proximity of failure. meaning that you can't do another rep or you're close to not being able to do another rep. If you're just using light loads and you're stopping 10 reps short of failure, then that's not going to have the same effect. So it doesn't mean you could just daintily lift some light weights and say, all right, now I'm going to, get huge. It doesn't work that way.
Okay, so maybe we could get into the complementarity of different types, if we could. I'd
Mhm.
keen to ask you a bit about the mechanisms, different and common mechanisms that might be going on there. But just that thought um, of going to failure, that as a similar approach. So you've got similar conditions. Is there a matching of work done for the muscle? I presume if you're doing light loads, you're going to be actually doing more work overall. And so it might not necessarily be like for like, but the conditions in the muscle at the point of contractile, concentric exercise, I can't really move the weight to completion anymore. That's the common factor.
That is correct. So it doesn't have to be work match. So set on a
Okay.
set for set basis when you're matching set volume. But we do have some evidence that even when it's work matched, there is similar effects. So
Okay.
doing some more heavier load sets, there's less evidence of that. But the primary way we look at it is the number of sets you do. The amount of work is generally not considered as much in the field. Because it kind of doesn't matter. You look at how many sets on a time basis. Now you could say it is somewhat less efficient to use from a time efficiency standpoint. A lighter load set is going to take you longer. If you're doing 30 reps versus 10 reps, and let's say your 10 reps is 30 seconds, you're doing let's say 1 up, 2 down, 1 second up, 2 seconds down. That's a 30-second set at 10 reps. It's a 90-second set with 30 reps. So there will be a greater time commitment in that respect.
Mm.
But again, it doesn't mean you have. I'm just saying that the science does show that you have options in that regard, and yeah, those are considerations. If your lifestyle, if that extra time is going to be detrimental to your lifestyle goals, then that's something you need to weigh in a cost benefit and a risk reward.
So if there's a similar response in terms of muscle growth, muscle size, etc., is the differences in the routes to get to the top of that mountain? Are there different mechanisms at play, or are there common mechanisms that are at work whilst you're recovering, adapting, integrating new proteins into the muscle? Is that stimulated by the same pathways?
Yeah, it's a good question. There is some evidence that there are different pathways involved, different anabolic intracellular signaling pathways. Um, Mechanistic data is difficult to make sense out of in a lot of ways because you can see differences in pathways, and does that necessarily mean there will be a synergism if you're using different pathways? That let's say you target this pathway using this type of strategy and this pathway from using this type of strategy, so they will have a synergism and you get greater growth. It's possible, but we don't have good evidence that that's the case. We don't have good evidence it's not the case either. I'm saying that
Okay.
just because it might have, there might be different pathways, you can't necessarily take that to mean there will be a synergism. There is some speculation that there is differences in fiber type growth, so that there is some evidence that your type 1 fibers are more targeted through light load training, and that your type 2 fibers, your strength related fibers, are more targeted through heavy load training. And there's a somewhat of a logical basis to this because your type 1 fibers are more endurance oriented. So if you're using time, a light load that has a higher time under tension, it might be more conducive to type 1 fibers, and vice versa. Your strength related fibers, greater force capacity, they're more fatigable. Could your higher force output required with heavier loads target them to a great extent? There is some A few studies have shown that, but there's been other studies that conflict with that. So I'd say the evidence is still rather weak, although I wouldn't dismiss that as being potential. I would say this, that there's the potential for it to have benefit, in my humble opinion here. So there's a potential benefit of combining loading ranges. There's no tangible detriment
Right.
that I can see logically or that we've seen in the literature. So I think it's a good strategy. This is where when I talk about practical recommendations, I'm giving you my opinion based upon what I know, what the literature shows, and also what I'm using my own expertise in combination with logical reasoning to draw inferences. It doesn't mean that that I might not change my opinion on that as we get more evidence down the road.
Right. Okay. And what that really opens up for me is variety, and keeping athletes engaged, keeping coaches engaged, and being able to program with real creativity that challenges and stimulates. I think that that simple idea of adapting to a training load, or the repeated bout effect, that you give the same thing to somebody and over time the body goes, yeah, maybe I'm not going to adapt to as much as I did before. Now, if you keep pushing and the training load is sort of the overall signal, that might make sense that you'll continue to get adaptation. But ultimately, you want to challenge the body. You want the body to be going, oh, that was tricky. And if you're going to do that again, I'm going to put new things in place and protect you. The whole principle of variety is so important to keep athletes engaged.
Yeah, and it also goes to the principle of progressive overload, that you need to challenge your body beyond its present state, and like you're saying, with a novel stimulus. So how do you go about providing that novel stimulus? That's where the art of training comes in. So we have the science of training, which gives you perspective on comparisons of variables and how they might interact. But the art of programming is taking the science and then using your expertise, because there are just so many different there are so many different interactions that you can't necessarily account for scientifically, and also just so many different ways to go about programming. Basically, there's a never ending, or virtually endless number of ways in which you can go about programming bodybuilding type style, or powerlifting, any type of goal. But purely from a muscle building standpoint, we have, just think of the variables. We have frequency, we have load, we have volume, we have exercise selection, we have type of action, eccentric, concentric, we have tempo. It can go on. So there's just many, many variables. And then there are the interactions between these variables. So when you change one, you potentially change another variable. And how does that work? So do you then need to add more volume or subtract more volume or change the frequency?
Mm. And what's emerging in the literature, or have you got some particular insights for those sports or events that have mixed abilities in the middle distance, for example, some strength endurance, even events like CrossFit, for example, that have got strength and endurance, and you need to build muscle for those abilities. Any thoughts about that sort of interference effect of doing low intensity endurance based work, the sort of jogger and the lean slow twitch types versus the power and the strength end of the spectrum?
So that's a real interesting question. And this is, again, another area where my opinion has evolved. I don't want to say it's changed, but it certainly has evolved to some extent. And there is evidence of what's called the chronic interference hypothesis, where endurance, especially cardiorespiratory endurance type training, and resistance type training, have conflicting pathways or elicit conflicting intracellular responses. So endurance, aerobic endurance type training it tends to elicit a more catabolic response, upregulates catabolic pathways, and this is again in a bubble because it's not a black and white thing, but I'm giving you kind of the simplified version of it. And the resistance training gives you or upregulates your anabolic pathways. And there's research dating back to the 90s, seminal research, which looked at mice. They took rodents and they stimulated them with electrical currents in a way, first in a pulsatile manner that would replicate like aerobic endurance type training, although it wasn't targeting the aerobic system per se, but it was targeting the muscles in a very highly endurance type manner, versus strong pulsatile stimuli that are intermittent, much more intermittent, that would tend to replicate resistance training. And it showed this chronic interference. It showed that the pulsatile, the high frequency pulsatile, where you're getting more endurance type, replicating the endurance work, upregulated the AMPK pathway, which is a catabolic pathway, and the pulsatile electrical stimuli that were replicating the resistance were more upregulating your anabolic systems, what was called your PI3K pathway, which is an anabolic pathway that that regulates mTOR, which is a anabolic enzyme. It's not that simple, and so it's nice to look at these type. That was an ex vivo study called ex vivo, where they basically stimulated the muscle outside of the animal. In human physiology, the way in what we call ecologically valid training practices, real world training, the body doesn't respond like it does under those types of conditions. And the evidence really has come around to show that there's not really much interference at moderate levels of aerobic endurance. So now if you start doing, let's say, long distance running, let's say you're going to do a marathon, you're going out running for an hour and a half, 2 hours a day, that's different. But in the classic, half hour, 40 minutes of steady state cardio, moderate intensity, steady state cardio, or conversely doing like your high intensity interval training, 20 minutes, 3 times a week, there's really no evidence that that has appreciable negative effects. In some respects, there's some positive adaptations that are seen, particularly for your untrained individuals. Now, when you're more well-trained, we don't have a lot of good data on that, and there is some at least logical rationale why you might need to do even less of that. But I do think that the evidence is coming around to show that as long as you have fairly moderate volumes, duration, frequency, your overall volume within, let's say, a week's time, it really is not going to have negative effects. And I'd also say that there are strategies that can be utilized to mitigate any negative effects. One of them is to try to separate the bouts either on separate days or, let's say, morning, evening. So if possible, the best strategy would be to do it, let's say, Monday resistance, Tuesday aerobic, etc. That doesn't work for a lot of people in a lot of ways. And a lot of times people are going to do resistance training more than 3 days a week. So that wouldn't necessarily line up. But if you can't do morning, evening, the best strategy is to do your resistance training first, your aerobic training after, because there tends to be more of a negative effect on your ability to carry out resistance training when you do the aerobic training first. So people tend to get more tired out from the endurance training, whereas the resistance training will not really have negative impacts on doing your cardio.
And is there an order effect in terms of what the body's left with last? In terms of if you were prioritizing strength and power, for example, if you did that second and that's the resonant stimulus that's left in the muscle, and if you were to flip them around, would it be the vice versa?
I'm not sure which. So again, Well, why don't you try to clarify?
Yeah, so if you were to say if you were maybe a 400-meter athlete and your priority maybe is more strength and power versus say a 1500-meter runner whose priority is endurance, if you were doing those training sessions together, could you flip the order where the priority is the stimulus that you value most, and that's left after the second stimulus is the one that the muscle perhaps is throbbing with afterwards.
Totally agree. And so I was basically saying if your goal is to maximize hypertrophy, that would be the strategy to do your resistance training first. If your goal, let's say if you are a distance runner, um, doing strength training is an afterthought. Well, I shouldn't say an afterthought, but it's an adjunct.
It's secondary.
It's going to be secondary to your primary goal. And it's important. Certainly, there is good evidence that there's even some evidence of an injury preventative effect, but certainly it helps to give a final kick, can help out in the last leg of a race. But it's not going to be your primary goal. And certainly, hypertrophy would not be a goal. So you'd want to focus on the strength aspect, which would be lower volumes. And in that respect, I certainly would recommend doing your aerobic training first, in under those conditions, and your strength training after.
So, certainly, my experience of working with sports people that have got conflicting demands, I think that my experience when you have to sort of course correct and you have to overdevelop a certain area because either it's been neglected or it's not responded. Say, for example, you've got a power athlete and the endurance is really starting to drop down. I'm going to and thinking of multi-eventers, heptathletes, decathletes now, where they have got competing demands. Um, my experience of when they get injured and you think, okay, we can't load them heavily, but so we're going to work on some of that those endurance qualities to build some of those up. I often find that some of the power aspect, the strength aspect, the muscle growth, it doesn't actually go down that much at all. It's always surprised me how much is preserved with general training, and that you have a genetic underpinning that is in one certain direction of being a sprint power athlete anyway. So you have to work quite hard to push it. I think the one thing that I would say is that when you've got different people looking at the same problem, you've got hot views. You've got people saying, no, 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 don't do the endurance for the heptathlete because that's going to affect the high jump. So you've got strong views about that interference effect, as opposed to perhaps the reality of what I've seen over time.
Yeah. So from a maintenance, I think you have to separate out
Yeah.
maximizing a certain quality, strength, power, hypertrophy, versus preserving that quality. And it is we're much easier to preserve a quality than it is to enhance the quality. So you can preserve hypertrophy by doing very low volumes of training, much less than your normal. There's one study showed that 1/9 of previous volume was sufficient to preserve the hypertrophy gain during a resistance training program
Wow.
in young individuals. Older individuals, they kind of have to do a little more. At least that study seemed to show that. But yeah, but you can maintenance is a much easier quality to achieve when it comes to then increasing, particularly as you become more and more well trained. So the more well trained you are, the closer you are to your quote unquote genetic ceiling, and thus the more difficult it is to continue gaining. Magnitude of gains and the time it takes to get those gains are going to be it's going to be a much steeper slope to climb to get those gains.
Mm. You mentioned before about when you're supporting athletes, you're looking to overcome a plateau for them, and so that as a simple signal, a simple message for people to tune into, that I hit a bit of a plateau, whether it's with a certain muscle group or whether it's a certain capability. that in itself, fundamentally thinking maybe I need to change things around. Maybe I do need to open up the different possibilities. Um,
Yeah, totally agree.
what's next for you in terms of research in this area? What are the next research questions that you're starting to probe? Because I love this line of questioning and research that at least asks the question. It opens up those possibilities. It opens up the variety. It opens up the loading range for people. What's next on the question list?
So I am very blessed to have a very passionate group of upper level master's students who do theses. And we have, I work very closely and mentor these students, but some of the times it's driven through them, the ideas, and we have a give and take. So sometimes I don't want to say impose my ideas, but offer my ideas to students to run with. And yeah, we have just so many studies, interesting studies that either have been carried out. We have a really cool one that's in review now that looked at supervision. So we had both groups doing the exact same routine. One group was fully supervised by our research staff. The other group did the same exact routine on their own. And we showed that supervision is actually a very important thing because the group that was supervised got substantially greater muscle growth, virtually on all the muscles that we looked at.
For like training, completed
Exactly the
exactly the
same.
same.
Yeah, and again, what we assume is that the people did not push themselves as hard when they were doing it by themselves, that they were substantially further away from failure,
Okay.
and that it seems you certainly should be in fairly close proximity. I wouldn't necessarily say you need to gut a failure, but you need to be pretty close to maximize your results. And apparently, again, we can't know. Trying to tease out again mechanisms is just not something we could do, but that makes logical sense.
Yeah.
Sure.
Is that
Um,
is that a psychosocial aspect there, or in terms of supervision? Supervision in terms of a Hawthorne effect of somebody watching over you, or are you talking about specifically spotting a bar?
could be partially due to that. So yeah,
Okay.
I mean, there is some evidence that getting feedback is important. I actually just we have a paper that was just published, should be coming out imminently, which looked at feedback on giving verbal feedback. And if you do it each rep, it's even better. So that's what we do generally. Come on, you could do it. Keep going, keep going. But it also could be, like you said, the Hawthorne effect. There can be ego effects too, that people want to, they don't want to look like they're wimping out, if you will. And it's,
Yeah. Okay.
I'm just and it could just be too that people, when they're on their own, they get more lazy. I mean, again, trying to get into the heads of what people are doing is very difficult, and trying to then tease out what the mechanisms are, we can't say. But certainly, it shows that the supervision aspect is important. It would show that having a personal trainer can be beneficial just in that sense, or perhaps even a workout partner who's pushing you. Or when I say having a workout partner, someone who is serious about training and who looks to push you. If you just have a workout partner where you sit around and talk all the time, that might be even worse. But anyway, that's a
That's another condition to, if someone's just chatting and distracting you, to see if it actually reduces the effects.
we have a study that we just finished. I won't get into it too much, but we looked at deloads, which, if you're not familiar with deloads, it's very popular in bodybuilding and powerlifting circles as well, where you train and then you take a period. Usually, it's 1 week of reduced training. Now, we did a detraining where they took the week off. A lot of times, it's just reduced. You'll do less volume, sometimes less intensity. So interesting findings there. We did a 9 week study. One group trained the whole 9 weeks. The other group took a week off in week 5. And we looked at various hypertrophy, strength, muscle endurance results. So that'll be interesting. We're just submitting that
Can you give
now.
us a hint as to? I'm already
Um,
kind of wondering about Per Agard's work about type 2X overshoots and whether you're actually getting a rebound effect of over adaptation during that rest period?
The hint that I'll give you is that it's caused me to rethink my previous way of thinking on it. But I don't want to give up too much here because we're still compiling the data. We're about to submit this, but I don't want to. It would be very nuanced, and again, without really having fully written up the manuscript. Now we're kind of in the process, getting ready to submit this shortly. So
Fascinating. So I love the tone of your communications. I love the fact that you are being true to those scientific principles of, look, this isn't my idea. This is the data. This is what the science is showing us, that here's the different possibilities. And I've really enjoyed the type of communication that you're putting out there, that I think is really supportive of the different possibilities for people's programming. So thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Brad. I really appreciate the conversation. I've loved it.
it's my pleasure, Steve.